Hey folks, welcome back to the CMECP series on electrical safety. My name is Paul Abernathy. I'm the acting director of the CMECP program. And today we're going to look at another chapter in the electrical safety series, and that is training of qualified and unqualified workers. Talk a little bit about the training, what it takes to be a qualified person. I've got a lot of documents that I'm going to refer to. So again, just sit back and listen and take in the information. A qualified person is somebody that's actually trained. They understand how to identify the hazards. They've shown proficiency in something, but we're not asking them to do something outside of their comfort zone. So if you're used to working on, say, gear that's 1,000 volts or less, and you're very proficient, you might be a qualified person for that. But now I'm going to ask you to go work on something that's maybe over 2,000 volts, maybe up to 15,000 volts, and it's medium voltage, or you move over into that area of the profession where you're dealing with medium voltage, then the training has to be different because it's different risk exposure. So again, you're not qualified professional or qualified person in the medium voltage realm if you're used to doing everything in the low voltage realm. And I'll remind you folks that low voltage is 2,000 volts and less. So when you hear people talk about 120, 240, 480, 277, things like that, that is all still considered low voltage. Right? When we start getting over 2,000 volts, we'll start getting into medium voltage, 2.3 up to 15,000 and things like that. That's a medium voltage level. The risks are higher in that voltage class than they are in the 2,000 and less, but the risks are still there. Okay, so it doesn't mean that the risks are not significant. They are most certainly significant, but we're talking about whether or not somebody's qualified person to be doing it, that type of thing. So we just want to talk a little about the training for qualified and the training for unqualified workers and all that type of stuff. So let's go on and get into that and knock it out. So this is chapter 3 in our series. We're talking again about qualified persons and the types of training that are involved with qualified persons. There's some objectives that we have to get at today. And we're going to talk about list the requirements of a qualified person must meet to be qualified. List the requirements of qualified electrical workers must meet. We're going to explain the types of training required for unqualified persons, and we're going to describe the types of training required by OSHA and NFPA 70E. Again, not to confuse this with you residential electricians who typically OSHA doesn't get involved in it. Although safety is extremely important and being a professional, not goofing around on site, taking your profession very seriously goes a long way towards electrical safety. Make sure you get the job done, get paid, get home, okay? It's a job, it's a profession. But we're gonna stick to electrical safety and talking about the training and associated with qualified persons or qualified electrical workers, okay? So that's kind of the focus of today. That's our objectives. All right, so an employee who has training on construction, operation, and hazards associated with low voltage power circuit breakers, whether it's low voltage power in switch gears, 480, 277, 240, 120, whatever it is you're working on, low power doesn't necessarily equate to you being qualified to work on medium voltage aspects where you have maybe 2.3 kV or even up to 15 kV. I know some people say, well, voltage is voltage, electricity is electricity, but the risk hazards are totally different, even though the equipment may operate very similarly. Right? The hazards are magnified when we get to medium voltage, not discounting the hazards involved with the low voltage application, but you may be qualified in the low voltage aspect, but you are not qualified in the medium voltage aspect. So again, just wanted to make sure that would need extra training. So if I'm going to do any work in anything medium voltage and I'm not familiar with it, I'm taking a new job, it's on the employer, folks, to make sure that they get you the proper training. It's also on you to be able to say, no, thank you. I'm not doing this. You're forcing me to do something. I'm not qualified for it. Remember, the risks associated with the work to be done are higher in the medium voltage than they may be in the low voltage. Although, again, as we saw in another episode where we started this journey in electrical safety, it really doesn't take a tenth of an amp to kill you. And we're really worried about arc blast, arc flash, and the shock component. So all those things have to be very fresh in our mind when we're working on something. And again, we're talking qualifications and know your limitations. For example, I would never take an electrician and have them do a PV installation if they've never done a PV installation. They are not qualified for it. Okay? There's many things that can go wrong. If you've never done a generator for a hospital or emergency system, then you may not necessarily be qualified. Now, you get some training, then you may be qualified. But just to do it because you hold the license doesn't necessarily make you qualified. Okay? It's important to remember those aspects of it. In other words, know your limitations. Now, when it comes to, I guess, when we think about the NEC and we think about OSHA, take this installation you see here on the screen. So all the covers are on, all the panels are on, there's no exposed live parts here. So according to OSHA, which is OSHA 1910.303 to 1910.308, that is derived from the NEC, okay, and it started all the way back in 2004 of the NFPA 70E Chapter 4, and is also extracted from the NEC, that when this is put in this condition, all the covers are on, all the fasteners are in place, everything's secured, we have no energized parts, and guess what? Then it is compliant. It's compliant with OSHA 1910.303 through 1910.308. So OSHA comes in, this is what they expect to see. Now, the moment that you go for maintenance, moment you go for servicing, anything like that, and you remove these covers, you remove these fasteners, at that point, you are not compliant with OSHA. Now, that might take place simply because you need to work on the equipment. Well, if that's the case, then you need to make sure that you're properly PPE'd up when you're working on this equipment, especially if it has exposed live parts in it. Now, that's where lockout tagout comes into play. That's where you put it in electrically safe condition. And remember that pyramid that we talked about in a previous video? If you haven't seen that video, go down to fasttrackstube.com, get a subscription. You can check out that video. It talks about the only most effective aspect of the risk is to eliminate the risk. PPE is the least effective. The most effective is to simply remove the risk, eliminate it. Okay. We understand that sometimes that is not going to be the case. Okay. So again, working on this now, if I'm working on this panel right here on the secondary side of this transformer, and I were to shut it off up here and lock this out, then I have eliminated the risk here. Okay. I have eliminated the risk through this transformer. Then I'm working in this panel. I have effectively eliminated it, and that is something that I can do. If I'm going to open this up and leave all this energized, then I'm going to need PPE to be able to do that. Okay, I have not eliminated the risk, so I'm trying to mitigate the effects of the burns of a blast or a flash. That's what I'm trying to minimize. Okay. Now, here's something important. Now, this gentleman right here is working on a piece of equipment. It probably had a door on it. It was probably an arc-resistant equipment with an arc flash door on it. He removed it, or she removed it to work on the equipment. Now, arc-rated PPE and equipment that would be appropriate for the risk and the task must be worn to protect the worker. Now, when the covers of that electrical equipment are open or removed for maintenance, servicing, troubleshooting, what have you, the equipment no longer is in compliance with OSHA 1910.303 to 1910.308. It just isn't, okay? But in doing so, this is why the gentleman had to put on safety equipment, right? PPE. So you have to follow the practices wearing PPE, rely on your training. Only the qualified person should be doing this work. In operating the arc-resistant equipment, the doors must be properly latched, or they are no longer considered arc-resistant. So if I have some type of component that's built into this equipment with a cover, a door on it, some kind of mechanism that signifies that it is arc-resistant, okay. But the moment I unlatch it or open it, all that's off the table, right? And you're essentially not in compliance with the OSHA requirements. When it was in place, you're great. Now, we do understand that you have to repair things. You have to go into things and do it. So we understand that. Right now, if you're using the NFPA 70E, which I encourage you to get a copy, and if you have NFPA link, you get it included. It's free. Well, it's not free, but it's in your subscription. Now, if that's the case, you would look at table 130.5C, and it says the arc-resistant equipment cannot exceed the rated available fault current for the specified time. If it does not meet the requirements specified in table 130.5C, it is no longer considered arc resistant. Okay, so you have to meet that table. And so NFPA 70E, the equipment, the time, the exposure, table 130.5C is what you're going to be looking for. So that is all within NFPA 70E. So if you're not familiar with the other ways to do the arc analysis and determining the exposure, engineers do that. They have software, they have calculation formulas they can use. But most of us say, okay, well, we're just going to use NFPA 70E. Now, it's easiest because you simply pull things from charts, right? But NFPA 70E might not cover every possible condition, and that's where you might have to turn to an engineer who give you assistance who has experience in being able to do these types of calculations, right? And if I'm an electrical electrician, I'm going to turn to somebody unless, again, I can use NFPA 70E to meet my goal. If not, then I'm going to go to a professional that can be able to do this for me. So unless maybe you've been trained to do it. But most of the time, you go to somebody that's going to give you the guidance. Go to your supervisor, and they will go to who they need to in order to find out what the proper protection you need to complete a certain task. Okay, but NFPA 70E does a really good job of getting you there. Okay. All right, so Verisafe. The Verisafe device by Panduit is a permanently mounted absence of voltage test device that meets the requirements of NFPA 70E 120.5. All right, so I'm going to read you a little bit about this so you have an understanding. It says, Panduit developed a device that meets the requirements of 120.5, exception number 1 to 7, and UL 1436, which is outlet circuit testers and similar indicating devices for permanently mounted absence of voltage testers. Okay, so in this figure, you see an example of one here. This is from Panduit Corporation. This is a new UL standard that satisfies all NFPA 70E requirements. Ordinarily, the company's name associated with the product would not be published in this text, but there are several permanently mounted indicating devices that have been marketed as a substitute for a direct contact test instrument, physically testing it. These earlier devices do not meet OSHA, UL, or NFPA 70E requirements and should not be used in the place of an absence of voltage test using voltage test equipment like this we see here. When selecting a permanently mounted absence of voltage tester, technicians must be certain to meet UL 1436 requirements. More detailed information can be found in the OSHA Letter of Interpretation dated December 12th, 2012. So if you go on the OSHA website, look for the OSHA Letter of Interpretation, and it would be published on December 12th, 2012. So this is an example of one of those, and it actually can tell you whether or not voltage is present or not for you work on equipment, okay? And obviously this meets 120.5. Now let's see if I have anything else that I want to speak on this. I might have some extra information on these devices, by the way. Nope, I don't have any extra information that I can share with those. So, okay, let's move on. All right, so here we go. It says the normal voltage for a motor circuit can be determined from the nameplate of the motor. Okay, so you're looking at it, you can see the nominal voltage. It should be posted on here. You have a nameplate, you have electric motor, and then you'll have what's called the voltage here. Of course, you and I know that when we're in the NEC and we're doing anything for motors, like the short circuit ground fault protection, conductor sizing, all that, we're going to be using the FLC. and 430.248, 249, or 250, depending on whether it's single phase, three phase, or whatnot. But on a motor, you can get the nameplate, you can get the nominal voltage, and you can get this electric motor. Obviously, all that's going to be on the nameplate. Now, OSHA uses the term nominal voltage to direct employees to nameplates, one-line diagrams, and schematics to find the nominal or design voltage of the circuit or equipment being worked on or near. For example, electric motors have nameplates with the nominal voltage listed on them. That's what we see in this figure. It's got a nameplate on it. By determining the nominal voltage, the worker can choose the proper rubber insulating gloves and voltage detector without having to make contact with the circuit first. Okay, so why is this important? In NFPA 70E is going to say, go to the motor, look at the nominal voltage, then select your PPE. It's not going to tell you to go to the NEC. You're going to go look at the nominal voltage and it's going to correlate with the tables in NFPA 70E, especially when what rubber gloves that you may need, O, whatever you need to work on this piece of equipment. Okay, so OSHA and all of them are going to specifically refer to nominal voltage by using the value that's given on the actual motor. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the minimum approach distances are provided in OSHA table S-5 for utilization equipment found in industrial facilities. This would be the correct table to use. Okay, so we got our gentleman standing here, and you have, let's see, in the picture here, we've got a 480 volt panel board. Okay, distance, the clearance distance based on the voltage present. So whatever the voltage present, and you have exposed energized conductors right here, right there at their termination right here. And you'll have a distance. And then you have what's called a qualified electrical worker, who is the one that's qualified to work on this piece of equipment or to be in this piece of equipment. Now, OSHA uses the term clearance distance to refer to the minimum approach distance for qualified electrical workers for the shock hazard only. So this is only dealing with the shock hazard. Okay, this is the distance a qualified electrical worker can approach exposed energized electrical conductors or circuit parts using rubber insulated gloves. Okay, having the conductors or circuit parts insulated to the circuit voltage, or being in a bucket truck insulated for the voltage. Okay, so again, this is all about the voltage exposure, right? These distances are the same or similar to the distances provided in, so if you're going in 70E, those would be table 130.4EA and NFPA 70E. So OSHA's table S-5 is very similar to what we would see in table 130.4EA in 70E. So by following 70E, then you can be compliant with OSHA because they mirror each other in this. Now, in the clearance distances specified do not include the arc flash hazard, okay, which can be considerably different. Shock hazards and arc flash hazards must be evaluated separately. So we're talking about what? The shock hazard distance, close and how close to something, but then we also have to be aware of an arc flash hazard, which is going to be done totally different. It's going to be evaluated in the analysis totally different from the shock hazard to the flash hazard. Two different things that you have to take into consideration, and whoever's going to be able to do the analysis is going to make that evident, okay? And so if you're using 70E, then you're pulling from tables, and it was designed to be the easier approach. It might be the more restrictive approach, but when you can go to a simple table and get the values you need, it makes it more likely that people are going to use it, I think. All right, now, OSHA recommends a combination of both instructor-led classroom training and on-the-job training, referred to as OJT, on-the-job training. Now, the types of training required by OSHA, both OSHA is 1910.332 OSHA 1910.333C, and NFPA 70E 110.6 tells us that it either has to be instructor-led classroom training or on-the-job training. The best training really is a combination of both. Now, you might be in a situation like when we were over COVID, then what we were doing was more classroom-led type of training. But if you're actually in the field or you're in a big company that has a lot of training programs, then on-the-job training, again, a mixture of both is the best way to train. You can get a little bit of both. There's nothing that takes the place of a little hands-on training, being able to touch the PPE, being able to try it on, being able to work in an environment, understand, to identify the different hazards and really see it. You really need that blended training. But at the end, you have to have one or the other. But the best is if you can get a little mixture of both in your training. I understand that you might not be able to get them both, but there you go. Okay, we're at the summary. Okay, it's a pretty quick one, right? So NFPA 70E states that the basic training requirements for qualified and unqualified persons are as stated in OSHA 1910.332. Qualified and unqualified persons are required to have sufficient training so they can perform their job tasks safely. When the covers of electrical equipment are opened or removed for maintenance, servicing, or troubleshooting, safety-related work practices such as wearing proper PPE, being able to assess the risks at hand and taking proactive steps to reduce that risk must be employed to protect the worker. So employers, you want to make sure that you have proper equipment. You want to make sure that you're able to provide that for all of your workers, and they need to know how to use the equipment as well. Goes on to say the type of training required by both OSHA and NFPA 70E is either instructor-led or on-the-job training. Okay, so you can have either or, but if you can get a mixture of both, then you're going to get the best of both worlds. And if you're one of those larger contracting companies, you're probably going to be able to get on-the-job training as well as adequate instructor-led type of training. The employer must determine what training is necessary and provide it. The employer must also understand the risks that are associated. If you're going to put somebody into a situation where they're going to be working with medium voltage, or they're going to be working with switchgear or something that's going to potentially have a higher risk to them, they need to be trained, and you are responsible. If somebody gets hurt and it comes down to an investigation by OSHA and there was not adequate training, because you have to keep training logs, the records of the training, all of that we'll talk about in upcoming episodes. All of that stuff is mandated by OSHA. And if OSHA gets involved, then again, you're going to have to produce that material. If it came to find out that you did not provide adequate training, yet you let an employee work on this equipment without that adequate training, then you have a serious, serious violation on your hands that you have to deal with. Not to mention the death or injury of somebody that you should care about. They're an employee of yours, or they work under you, but they've got a family. And this is critically important. We all want to go to work and go home. That's it. We want to do great jobs at work, but we want to also make it home to our families. Now, going back to our summary so we can end this module up. It says a qualified person must be trained annually in emergency release methods. So we have to make sure they know how to do things like CPR, first aid, the use of an AED. Okay. We have to use, and if AED use is included in the ERP, then if it's included in that, then you have to make sure, okay, that that program, that you have to make sure that they're trained on it properly. All of this equipment has to obviously be maintained, calibrated, kept in top working order. And lastly, all training is required to be documented, right? So any training that goes on, and obviously my advice even to smaller, mid-sized contractors, or if you're the big contractor, do me a favor, make sure that every time you do training, you document it, right? And you keep track of it so that if somebody gets hurt, heaven forbid, at least it doesn't come back that you didn't do the training. It only takes a little, and there's a lot of free training out there, right? A lot of the manufacturers that supply different types of equipment, okay, have to be aware of that. and they provide certain types of training. With unqualified persons, they don't necessarily have to be working on equipment, but they still, if you have unqualified persons that are in your care, maybe they're the cleaning crew or something, but maybe they work around this equipment, not on the equipment, but work around it. Then there's a certain level of training that has to be provided to them as well, so they understand what the boundaries are and to stay away and be aware of it. So they're not necessarily qualified to work on it. They're unqualified, but there has to be a certain level of awareness, and that you must make sure that everybody is aware of those hazards there and they avoid them. Okay, not just the qualified, but the unqualified as well. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to give to you. Oh, only thing I'll tell you is a couple things I will tell you from NFPA 70E. And I'm not sure if I can bring this up. I'm not sure if I can or not. Let's see here. Let's see if I can. I don't think it won't let me bring it up. So I'll just read it to you. It's some documents. I have tons of documents that I always refer to. So NFPA 70E, which I encourage you to get used to. It's not a very thick document. It says in 110.6A1C4 contains the requirements that a qualified person must be trained in the decision-making process in order to plan the job, identify the electrical hazards that may be present, assess the associated risks that are involved, and select the appropriate risk control method using the hierarchy of control in 110.5H. And that is whether you eliminate the risk or you use PPE. You have to determine which is going to be best course of action. That's specifically a task that whoever's assigning the person or the person that's getting ready to work on something has to go through that hierarchy of risk assessment to determine what level of protection is necessary. It might be that you have to eliminate the risk in order to be able to effectively safely work on it, that type of thing. So I encourage you to really understand NFPA 70E. Get a copy of it, kind of look it over. If you're on a project, you should have one on site and to look at. Another reference that I'll give you is that NFPA 70E requires that a worker be able to perform a risk assessment, choose the proper PPE and equipment, plan the job, and conduct a proper job briefing. Okay, so it requires that a worker can do that, and that's part of your ongoing training, right? I certainly would not send somebody in to do this work that was not prepared or had the proper training to do it. Pretty straightforward, right? All right, well, that's pretty much everything that we have for this quick session. Again, electrical safety training has to be provided, documented. Remember, there are PPEs that have to be selected. You need to train people on how to identify the hazard, what PPE is, what levels they need, how to identify the risk. All of that's part of the training in order to be a qualified person. And then for those that are unqualified, you still have to provide training to them so they're aware of where their surroundings are, what equipment they may be working now, what the boundaries mean. If you see somebody working on something and you have a certain type of approach boundaries, how they're to address that. They need to be educated on that, even if they don't work on the equipment. If they're going to be in that environment, then they have to be educated on that. That's all part of training, folks. All right? So hopefully you got something out of that. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless, and we'll see you in the next episode. Take care now.